and educator of the three principles, an approach that is gaining increased momentum for coaches, therapists and clients across the globe. He founded One Thought in 2010 and One Thought practitioner training, and he is here today to enlighten us all. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Aaron Turner.
Hello. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be able to come to a group of committed professionals who are helping people and talk to them a bit about the three principles. My goal in this talk, I don't know how realistic it was. We'll see over the next hour. Okay. Is I'd like to give you an introduction to it so that you have some idea, because I think increasingly you'll hear more and more about it. I know that some people may have heard of it and some people not, so I'm going to talk as if nobody's really heard of it. But I want you to go away with some idea of what Three Principles is about and how it has implications for people's well-being and therefore in terms of those trying to help people with their well-being. So the first thing I wanted to say is I'm talking solely about people's well-being, solely about their experience of life, solely about their clarity of mind, their functional versus dysfunctionalness. That's it. I'm not talking about anything else. I'm just talking about the issue of well-being and mental health, which, as we'll discover, and as you probably already know, has ripple effects in every other area of people's lives. So as people get more dysfunctional, things fall apart. You definitely don't want a dysfunctional person running your life. If you could possibly avoid it, keep them out of your relationship, keep them out of your job, keep them out of your neighborhood. Definitely having a dysfunctional person represent you in any area of your life is a problem. Because they don't think clearly, they're very emotionally reactive, they have less perspective, and I'm sure you know that. So as you help people discover more confidence, more well-being, more mental health, and it is worth saying, everything I know about hypnotherapy I learned this morning. So, which means we all know there's some part of what we all know that's the same. So please forgive me for that part of my ignorance. But you'll see that as people's well-being increases, that ripples out into their relationships, into their jobs, and as some of the speakers said, into their weight loss, into their health, into those other areas. But in terms of the discussion of the three principles, it's purely focused on people's level of well-being, clarity of mind, and mental health. So that was my first point. That was quick. That's done. We can move on now. So the second thing I wanted to say, having listened to this morning, is if you can listen to me as if we're in a time warp, that would be really helpful. So if you can suspend all your previous knowledge, like I am, I'm not thinking about what I learned this morning, I'm just thinking about what I'm saying. But if you can put aside what you already know and just listen to what I'm saying, almost as if it's an oddity, that I'm going to talk about it in and of itself, because I realized this morning that there's quite a lot of overlap between key parts of what we call the three principles and the underpinnings and the application of hypnotherapy. And I think it would be easier to take the principles in and of themselves and then see the similarities and differences as opposed to trying to put them together. Would that be okay? Okay, great. Great, so let's get started. The first thing I wanted to say is the three principles, so historically, comes from the insights of a man called Sydney Banks. It just so happens that my uncle was one of the first psychologists to see the relevance of his insights and apply it to his work within psychology, and at the time they were relationship counselors. I myself spent 10 years working and studying with them as a counselor and a business consultant, and then as my introduction said, I formed One Thought and came to work in the UK, primarily with businesses and practitioners. And the interesting part that I've found over the years of the three principles is it's not an approach. That's the first thing to say. As soon as you start looking at it as an approach, it stops making sense. It's the most fascinating thing. It's purely an understanding. It's an understanding of, it claims, I'm going to try and be very neutral here. It claims to be an understanding of the fundamental dynamics of the mind and the way that it affects us as human beings. And what's interesting about it is, the premise of it is, or the observation of it is once people get an understanding, they change. There's no intervention, there's no application, there's no technique. Now, the underlying assumption underneath that is, your mental health right now is a function of your current understanding. So, unbeknownst to you, or maybe beknownst to you, because you're all therapists, the way you understand the mind has pluses and minuses in terms of your mental health right now. And any techniques you apply help with the minuses of that understanding. They help you kind of cope with the fallout of your current understanding. Right? And as the speakers this morning suggested, you can't really go through life without building up an understanding of things. Like, your mind is trying to put it all together, and there's no guarantee it's being done in an accurate way. It's been done based on experience and the past, and so you kind of got this accumulation of knowledge that you have to live with the results of. And what's interesting about the principles is it gives us the chance to step back and take a look at what we're suggesting are principles of the mind that allow you to kind of re-baseline your understanding of what you're dealing with. Not what you're trying to do, but as a thinking, conscious human being, what you're dealing with. What is the mind, and what's it doing, or what's it doing to us, and what do we have to do with it? And the underlying premise that I find fascinating is that if someone gets a clearer understanding according to these principles of the mind, there are naturally mental health implications, which has led me to believe that in terms of our mental health, it's our understanding of what we're dealing with that helps or hurts us. And what's fascinating to me is that's been my experience. So I've been interested in these principles for 25 years. Before I got interested in them, I was pretty sure I understood how the mind worked and what I was and how I worked. And I had certain symptoms based on that. I was phobic of flying. I was socially anxious and self-conscious. I had low level of enjoyment because I was largely preoccupied. Someone mentioned worrying earlier. Very worried. And I never had a relationship that was longer than 3 months. Okay? Now, what was interesting to me is I didn't realize they were a symptom of my level of mental health. I didn't realize that. So I would sometimes wonder and think, hold on a second, you've had X number of relationships, every single one's been 3 months. Does that seem like a likely coincidence to you? I was thinking, no. But then again, there were different reasons for every 3-month relationship. In this case, that, in this case, that, in this case. And I think this morning people talked about that, how your mind explains things. You know, I had a bunch of becauses that overruled my ability to see the pattern or understand what was behind the pattern. Now, when I started learning about the principles, which I'm going to lay out for you in a minute, all of that changed. Like, I look back now, flying's one of my favorite things. Public speaking's one of my favorite things. Before I learned the principles, I was an academic. And I was so nervous that in the conferences I spoke at, I had to read my paper. And even I didn't understand the logic of that. I mean, I'm getting up there with this paper and I'm thinking, this is stupid. Why don't they just read it? Why would I sit here? And why does it have to be me? Surely someone else could just read it. But I was so nervous, I didn't know what else to do. I was a musician. Well, you could see I wasn't a musician when I tell you what happened, but loved music. And in rehearsal, not just me, but everyone thought I was pretty good. So, oh, you should play sessions, you're really good. I loved it. In public, I couldn't play in tune or in time. I couldn't do it. And I tried. I really tried. Every concert was like, this one, we're going to do it. Don't freak out. Don't freak out. Remember what happens when you freak out. So, as you probably can see, I was pre-freaking out. But I couldn't see it. I could see it, but I couldn't get underneath it, right? Since learning the principles, I've played in bands and enjoyed it. It's the same in rehearsal as it is in the... Now, what's interesting about that is I didn't work on a single one of them. Like, it took me a few years to realize, I think I used to be scared of flying. And like the spy, I really thought I was taking my life in my hands when I was getting on a plane. I really thought that and felt that. And now I absolutely love it. I'm flying somewhere tonight and can't wait to get there. To the plane, not to the place. And that's interesting to me. But what I'm hoping to do in this hour is show you what the principles are, what's meant by them, and then try and give you a feel for how it leads to that kind of change. And I would really, my goal is to leave time for questions because I want to make sure you have a chance to kind of see what I'm trying to say, so you can ask me questions a bit. So you with me so far? The principles is an understanding. The understanding has an impact. Now, it's because of the nature of the understanding. So Sydney Banks claimed that he had an insight into the nature of the mind and encapsulated it in terms of three principles. So just as the earlier speaker said, what I'm saying about the three principles is my description of the underlying dynamics or fundamental building blocks of human experience. That's the way it's intended, right? So as a theory or whatever, it's maybe helpful, but it's most helpful as a way of making certain elements of human experience more visible than they would otherwise be. You with me so far? And when they become visible, it demystifies experience in a very freeing way, such that you can have the same experience without it having you, which changes you from having to change people's experience to just helping them be able to understand it in a way that they're not scared of it anymore, or it doesn't cause them to get dysfunctional. So you can get nervous without falling apart. Or you can get angry without, breaking anything. I don't know, I'm making it up. Now, I'm going to start with the most obvious. So the principles, just in case anyone's wondering, is mind, consciousness, and thought. As you can see, that tells you nothing. Well, I'll start with the most visible, and that's consciousness, right? Now, what's meant by that is that every human being, every moment of every day, is having an experience, right? In their world, they're having an experience of reality, right? And you can run through that and you can say, yes, that is true. There's sensation. So in this moment, there's a temperature out there, and some of you are feeling it more than others. Some, before I mentioned it, some people might not have noticed it. Some people might have been saying, God, if it wasn't so hot in here, I could listen. And some people might be thinking how much they like it. But there's elements in people's experience every day, every moment of every day. And it's hard to break down accurately, but there's emotions in there, there's perceptions in there, there's sensations in there, that you're having an experience. And as was hinted at this morning, or actually explicitly stated, that's individual to the person. And we know that. We don't quite understand it, but we know that two people go to a movie, and like my wife and I went to see Black Swan, and I really didn't want to go. I thought, well, I'll just use it as an excuse to snack for 2 hours, Didn't really expect to enjoy it. And at the end of the movie, I was like, oh my God, I get it. And she was like, that was terrible. Same movie. And that's normal. So the first one is consciousness. There's no getting away from that, right? So there's no switching that off. I'm going to take a break from experience. That's not an option. Thought is the second principle. And the reason that's relevant, now, the other thing to say about this is forget previous definitions of thought just for the sake of understanding what I'm trying to say, okay? I'm using thought to refer to the way the mind creates your experience, right? So thought is there to help us appreciate that whatever your experience of reality is, whatever consciousness is for you at that moment, that's being created by thought. In other words, let me say it differently. That's being created by the mind through thought. So thought's just a way of saying your mind creates content, and that content runs through your sensory system, and you would call it an experience, right? So my daughter, just to illustrate, realizes she's hungry, and I'm suggesting you only know you're hungry because you have a thought that's brought to life in your experience, in your consciousness, in your senses. How many times have you gone to work, thought, you're a different kind of work. Before you became hypnotherapists, you probably had the experience where you'd go to work and be so focused on things that it wasn't till the end of the day you realized you were hungry, right? Biologically, you were hungry hours ago, but it wasn't till you had that moment of recognition that came through a thought, right? And that's how you get the experience. And you get the experience in whatever form the thought occurs. So whatever emotional tone, whatever perspective, that's what you get. So my daughter gets the thought, I'm hungry, and then she uses that thought to obsess about how hungry she is. So you can see that the more thought you put into something, the bigger it grows. I know you know this already from this morning's talks. So she absolutely gets intolerably hungry, and she expresses that quite freely, until she forgets about it. So we're on the way home from the station. I'm hungry. I don't know when I can't tolerate it anymore. She sits down. I'm like, well, that means you'll be hungry longer. You're sitting down. We still have to get home. I don't know. And then 5 minutes later, she forgets she's hungry, and she's walking along, singing. Now, she's still probably biologically actually hungry, but without the thought, she doesn't have the feeling. She doesn't have the sensation. So the first part of the principles is that reality, such as we know it, and I know this isn't new to you, but this is where there's a massive overlap. Reality, such as we know it, is constructed by thought moment to moment, which is really helpful because a key mental health problem that causes suffering and dysfunction is that people take their negative experiences as if they're real. So they're unduly frightened by them, intimidated by them, worried by them, disturbed by them, and then they try to do something about it from that same thinking that caused it, and they get into dysfunction. Right? Now, what's interesting about the thought, such as I'm referring to it, is it's very important to recognize that thought is just a momentary bubble of energy from the mind. That's just a metaphor way of saying it. But it points to the fact that thought does not have a life of its own. It creates an experience of something that has a life of its own. So when you get angry, it often feels like you are going to be angry until you sort it out. Or if you get down or anxious, sometimes it feels like you're going to be that way for a long time. But if you step back, you'll see that thought has no life of its own. It comes in and it goes. It comes in and it goes. It's easier to see this with non-emotional thought because we don't react to non-emotional thought, right? So if somebody says, remember these 3 numbers, you have to keep thinking them. Otherwise, you completely forget them. Because you can't say, oh, I'm going to think them, 475, and leave the thought there and expect to come back and find it. It completely dissolves because from this perspective, it's in the nature of thought to dissolve. It doesn't have a form of its own, which if you can see that, it's only our reaction to thought that fuels its ongoing existence. Just like remembering a number, 475, 475, 475, and then someone says, Aaron, are you going to move on? And then I forget it because I haven't rethought it, so it disappears. And without that, negative experiences have no existence. They have no existence. I've worked with depressed people who are very depressed, but as they get into a conversation, they're kind of more in the conversation than the thought of the depression, their mental health improves. You say, oh, glad to see you're feeling better. They say, oh, yeah, well, let's get back to the topic. Here's my struggles, right? Now, there's a huge degree of perspective to realize that your negative experiences are only as real as you make them. In truth, they're thought deep. They have the existence of a thought, which is as long as you think it. And there are two parts of that are relevant. Firstly, as that demystifies suffering for people, that when you have, now I'm going to call it this and I'll explain it later. When you have negative thought, which I'm going to suggest is contaminated thought, and I'll explain that in about 7.5 minutes, it changes your view of reality. So you feel bad, you feel like there's something wrong with you, you see things in a complicated, disturbing light, you become more emotionally sensitive. Once people realize that's a symptom of a certain kind of thought, just like getting wet is a symptom of a certain kind of weather, it stops it from being very relevant in a way that you would kind of run after it and analyze it and kind of get more into it. Because you realize everybody's thought is fluid. Because it doesn't have a form of its own, our mind is just creating experience, like a bubble machine or a bingo thing. Boom! Number 12, anxiety. Boop! Number 0, well-being. You know, and you're on the end of it, getting that. Now, as people start to understand that their negative experiences can only exist in thought, and I'll explain that, and in a temporary way. In other words, and people said this earlier, as the thought passes by, people calm down and feel better. And if you look at disturbing experiences, you have to put energy into them to keep them going. It's the only way. And it's an interesting thing, but it allows people to diffuse their phobia about negative experiences. And that's what happened to me, in hindsight, that's what happened to me on the plane. Is I went from thinking being anxious meant I was in danger, and that logically I could see that from an anxious state, that I was very high above the ground, and if anything happened, my chances were slim. You know, I could see that. But what I didn't see is that when people are anxious, they see in a very insecure way, and that outlook is not trustworthy. It's editorialized according to anxiety and insecurity. And I went from trusting it and trying to deal with it, read a book, don't think about it, think of all the times you did arrive, well, it's always the last time you don't arrive, you know, and from an anxious state, there's no arguing with it, because all the thinking you're having is a function of the distortion, right? Now, once I learned that thought was variable and it goes in and out of distortion, and anxiety was not an insight into danger, it was a departure from clarity. All of a sudden it became an acceptable, understandable experience, but unremarkable. So someone said, did you get on the plane? Yeah. Were you anxious? Yeah. Were you okay? Well, yeah, I get anxious at home. I get anxious on the bus. I get anxious on my birthday. You know, I get anxious all the time. So you start to be able to appreciate the non-threatening nature of experience, because it's all just a conveyor belt of thought. None of it affects you other than it puts you into that reality for that moment, right? So in my previous relationships, when I got down, I used to think there was something wrong with my girlfriend. Yeah, I'm not feeling good. I think I'm not. When I realized these principles, I realized, oh, that's a symptom of your thinking getting dissatisfied. So now it's like my wife says, are you, and we've been married longer than 3 months. My wife says, are you okay? And what I'm feeling is, I would be if you weren't here, because, and then the list goes down. But I know what's happening to me. My mind has gone into what I would call a distorted state in which she looks like she's upsetting me, but actually the upset was there before she came. And I know this is true because I see it in the way she experiences me, right? So when she's upset or down or dissatisfied, she sees all the reasons why I'm upsetting her, right? Now, I used to think if I changed those things, I would eliminate the cause of the upset. So I keep things tidy, but that didn't work. It was only after getting a clearer understanding of these principles, I realized ups and downs are natural. You can't avoid them. And what I've noticed is when she's down, she can't imagine how anyone could live with such a disrespectful slob, right? And when she's in a good place, she thinks she's the luckiest woman on the world to be with someone and then she sees all the things she likes. And I swear I'm the same. Like I can testify. It's not like she catches me on a good day. And sometimes when she's in a down place and I'm doing a particularly good job of being a good husband, it's still no good. So you start to see that through thought and consciousness, we're experiencing, as Trevor said, an illusory reality, right? Now, what I've learned, or what the principles points to, is understanding that such that you're comfortable with it is a mental health variable. So originally I thought, so it's all thought. I'm going to get in a different state then. All right, thinking is go. And the idea that your state matters can cause pressure and insecurity and dissatisfaction and judgment, etc., etc., etc. Whereas if you really see the illusory nature of all states, it allows you to understand and get comfortable with them in a way that gives you understanding and well-being even when you're in it. Even when you're in it. So I was telling Stuart, I was working with a woman who was claustrophobic and agoraphobic. We didn't know where to meet. So it was one of my early clients, and I said to her, I thought to myself, well, she doesn't realize it's just thought, right? And I learned a lot from this. So I go in there, I said, this will take a couple minutes. I said, well, she tells, I'm terrified of small spaces and I'm terrified of going out. I said, well, the thing is, terror is just thought. She said, I know. Now, here's where I realized understanding the nature of thought matters. And I talked to her, I realized she didn't care that it was thought because she was frightened of it. And what she didn't know is that if you break it down, it's nothing to be frightened of. It really isn't. Every negative experience you're frightened of, you've already been through. Right? And it only lasts as long as you think it. And as soon as it's over, you're totally fine, which I'll come to. It's the principle of mind. So we talked about that. And she saw it, and she felt better. And it was very cute. She said it so well. She said, now that I understand I'm experiencing my own mind and what the nature of that is, I went to the mall with my granddaughter. I said, well, how was it? She said, it was great. There were two things that were surprising. One is, most of the time, I was totally fine walking around, having a good time. We really enjoyed it. All right, and I'll explain that in a second. And secondly, it was interesting because before I could stop her, my granddaughter ran onto the elevator. I said, well, was that bad? She said, well, I'm terrified of elevators. I said, well, what happened? She says, well, I got on the elevator with her. I said, well, how was that? She said, oh, I was terrified. I said, well, how was that? She said, oh, it's fine. It's just thought. That's interesting to me. See, as soon as I have someone, or me myself, whether it's me or a client, is averse to a certain feeling or experience, I know I don't understand, it's just thought. And as soon as you understand it is just thought, you're able to live with it. And if you're able to live with it, you don't get the dysfunctional consequences of it. You don't bake it in to your associations. Like one of the things when people try to avoid negative experiences, they try to figure out where it comes from. So they create associations between the thought and the environment, which, just to be clear, don't exist from my way of understanding it. Anybody can have any thought in any circumstance, which means your experience in any moment is completely up for grabs. And if you relate to it as if it's thought, you keep getting new ones. You keep getting new ones. That's how I learned about social anxiety. I thought social anxiety was something I had to deal with. And I thought overtime to do it. All right, I'm nervous. What am I going to do about that? Then I want to say something. What shall I say? Oh, I'll reply to that. Damn, it's gone. Okay, what next? And I was so behind the curve that I was, Now, when I realized that insecurity was thought, I realized, oh, it's fine. It's fine. It's a normal function of fluid mental activity. So it went from defining me and something I had to deal with in order to try to have a conversation in which I always failed, to realizing it's just something that happens to people while they're doing life. It doesn't help, but it's not a big problem. So what would happen is I'd be in a conversation and then I'd start to feel self-conscious. And feeling self-conscious, I get all the symptoms of that reality. Something wrong with me? What am I going to say? Oh, don't say that. That's terrible. Well, it's too late now. All right, move on to the next, right? But it didn't look worth doing anything about because it was dying as soon as it was born. Because it's just thought. So it drifted out, and what I discovered is, oh, it comes and goes. Now, here's the interesting part. When it goes, your mind becomes incredibly functional with no effort on your part. That's the fascinating part, and that's the principle of mind. The principle of mind refers to the fact that our mind has a nature, and that nature is something that I'll summarize it in a superficial way. In that nature of the mind, people experience high levels of well-being and intelligence. Now, we don't fully comprehend the scope of the power of the mind. I think we might all agree on that. But the interesting part is, as thought comes and goes, our minds always default back to a less thought-obscured mind, a clearer thought, a more neutral thought, in which you default to clarity. So when I didn't run off into my own thinking to try and figure out how not to be insecure, I automatically found that 2 minutes later I was having a grand old time, a great conversation, and I didn't have a problem, right? And this flip-flopping between high levels of clarity, well-being, and mental health and distortions of thought, that's the nature of the mind. You have this power of intelligence creating moment-to-moment thoughts that give you experiences as if they're real because they're running through your sensory system, of dysfunction, of anger, of well-being, of clarity. But with the knowledge that clarity of mind and intelligence and well-being is the nature of the mind, and anything else is created through the creative power of thought, which is why, this isn't fair, I'm picking on my wife, but she's not here. So when my wife gets angry with me, she gets upset, she has a thought, I get upset, I have a thought, right? And it's like, you, right? We go away from each other sometimes. And there's been a few times where I just think it's such a great example. And I'm the same way sometimes. But I watch her and she's cooking. And then as she's cooking, you can see her stop focusing on the upset. You know that feeling like sometimes you're focusing on, I can't believe they said that. And because you're focusing on a thought, you're just re-energizing that experience. But in this case, she wasn't. She got into the cooking and she started to forget about the thought. And you could see her lighten up. Now, I'm suggesting that's an example of an innate default dynamic of the mind that outside of your moment-to-moment thoughts, which can get really dark and really uncomfortable and really sinister and really dysfunctional and unclear and blown out of proportion, etc., you cannot alienate the fact that underneath that is the unrestricted power of the mind that effortlessly regenerates. As soon as the thought's gone, it's like, this is so cheesy, I can't even believe I'm saying it, but kind of like the sun and the clouds, sorry. You know, that one's a constant and one's a variable. Dysfunctional thought is a variable. And it's a key mental health problem that people over-respect it and give it more life than it really deserves, so that you end up putting more focus on it. As opposed to realizing, no, you are a perfectly healthy mind, you just have some messed up thinking. And the more you make of that thinking, the longer time you're distracted. Right? So in this case, I see my wife start to calm down, and she feels better. You can see it. Because she says, oh, hey, you know what we should do tomorrow? And she's talking to me, whereas normally, you know, you have to serve your time, you know? So, and here's the interesting part. She didn't mean, it happened because she lost concentration. So she realizes and she says, oh, yeah. Right? Now, that's the human condition. You're in a reality of your thoughts making. It's no more real than a thought. And that thought is guaranteed to dissolve because you cannot concentrate enough to keep it in place. You cannot. Right? Even when I've done clinical work, there are always moments and periods of mental health, clarity, perspective. But people don't respect them. Like when I lived in anxiety, I'd kind of drop into these states of just tremendous well-being and peace of mind and confidence. I'd be like, wow, this is amazing. Pity it's not realistic. Now, where were we? Right? And the only thing that changes, the dynamic does not change. Suffering is a thought. It lasts as long as you think it. Well-being is a default. It's a birthright. It's unavoidable. The only thing that changes is your understanding. Do you know that? And if you know that, you tend to have more confidence in the face of your dysfunction, right? Even if you don't see it totally clearly, right? So I had a period a few years ago, I was sharing more than I thought. And I didn't really see it fully as thought. So I was ruminating and battling and thinking and trying to figure it out. But underneath it all, I knew I was just ruminating. So even though I felt there was something wrong with me, I didn't think it was really serious. Whereas before I understood this, every time I felt bad and it lasted because I was thinking about it, I honestly thought there was something seriously wrong with me. And that knowledge is invaluable, absolutely invaluable. I was 10 years into this, I was driving down the road and I suddenly realized I'm feeling really anxious. And then my anxious thinking, because when your thinking gets distorted, it's not your friend. It's so crafty. So my thinking starts to say to me, oh, Aaron, it's been 10 years. You just thought you changed. You didn't really change. And here's the proof. You're as bad as you ever were. And I'm thinking, that's true. In this moment, I'm as bad as I ever was. And my spirits from that second thought just went, boom. And I thought, oh, my God. And then I had that thought, little thought of clarity came out. What if this is just a thought? Well, that's a pretty big one. Yeah, but what if? That means if you buy it, you have to live with it. You have to take it home, right? Until you take it, recycle it or whatever. But you don't have to because it's just a thought. Any experience, if this is true, any experience you have, you don't have to worry about it. It's a thought in your head, but it doesn't have to be your thought. It's just one that happened to pop into your head. It doesn't have to be your problem. So I thought, oh, I don't believe it, but I'm going to try that. Well, I turned the corner, I'm accelerating out of the corner, and I noticed I feel totally better. But just imagine if I hadn't thought that. And I thought, oh yeah, good point. Da, da, da. Because if you take a thought as real, even though it's in principle only temporary, you have to live with it that way. And so that's, people see that, and we do it all the time. Like, oh, I don't enjoy work as much as the weekend. All right, let me take that thought to work. And then they say, there's something wrong with work. Whereas they started thinking it before they got there. So, those are the three principles. And the idea of it is that people unleash their mental health by seeing and being willing to consider the illusory nature of suffering and the reliable nature of mind. Because the other mental health problem that people have is they believe that you can help yourself by thinking. Whereas everything that was said this morning suggests that the most useful thought, the most useful mental processes happen when you're not thinking, right? Which is that impersonal intelligence. It's not you. It's the mind. And as you start to realize, oh, I'm all right, I got perfect mental health, I got all the intelligence I need, I don't even need to do my thinking, it's like, that can all... And every time you, when you suffer and you have these scary realities, you can go back to the recognition, oh, this isn't real. Scary, yeah. Unpleasant, yeah. I'm a dysfunctional nutcase in this state. But you're isolated from the negative effects of it because you know what it is. It's like those mirrors on the car that say, objects in the mirror appear further away than they are. They put that there because if you know it, it's not a problem. If you don't know it, it's a problem. Because you crash into things. Because you don't know what you're dealing with. And that's why the cure to dysfunction from this perspective is knowing what you're dealing with. So that even though you feel bad, you feel reactive, you go into fight or flight, you know it's a trick of the mind, you know it's temporary, and you know you don't need to do anything. So that's an overview of the principles and an overview of it as a therapy. The only thing to say that I wanted to say as an implication of it is, instead of dealing with the results of how seriously people take their dysfunctional thinking, you're essentially helping them to understand that it's not real, that they're actually fine, that it's just what it is to live with a mind that creates thought and that everything you think becomes real. We don't fully appreciate that. We don't really appreciate how real thought becomes to us. I know you guys do because you deal with phobias and all of that, but for ourselves. The other thing that is interesting about this that I've discovered is my clients respond to my understanding. There's no technique, there's no intervention. Because I understand it, it comes across. I have a colleague, Bill Pettit, who's actually speaking at the conference that I'm give you the details of, so it'd be lovely if you came. He's been working in clinical psychiatry for 30 years using this approach, and he basically says to people, you're mentally healthy, you're just innocently relating to your thought in a really, really bad way, right? And when they get well, because they start to realize that, he says to them, what was it that made the difference to you? They say, the certainty you had that there was nothing wrong with me affected me. And I thought, they've given me a doctor that's crazier than I am. Right? But then I thought, he's either crazy or he knows something. Now, if these principles are at all in line with what's actually going on, it is people's conviction about their suffering states, their perceptions, their emotions, when they're in distorted states. It's the conviction that's the problem, because they take on something that was essentially illusory as if it's real. That's the mirror without the warning, right? As soon as they see they appear closer. Oh, okay, I got it. They stop crashing because they're relating to it in a more aware, enlightened, advised way. I'm so happy. I really wanted to give you a chance for questions. I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover, and so shall we have some questions? Yeah.
Will you turn these on, please? Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you, Aaron. That's certainly
it's a
something to
pleasure.
think about.
Yeah, pleasure. So we're not having questions?
We do have time
Oh,
for
we do
questions.
have questions.
We've got one here.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you. That was really entertaining and
good.
interesting.
Good.
So the question I've got, which is easiest to ask with a quick metaphor or a story. So the other day, in my house, we've got a smoke. In the other, we have a smoke alarm in the house,
Yes.
and it's a 4-story house, and so lots of smoke alarms go off on every floor every time somebody makes a piece of toast or to something in
Yeah.
the kitchen, and you just get used to it going off and
Yeah.
going, it's the damn smoke alarm
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
And you watch the smoke alarm, and you know you go downstairs,
Yeah.
and it'll pass.
Yeah.
The other day, I'm sitting up in my study and the smoke alarm goes off. I think it's the damn smoke alarm again. It's an irritant, but I watch it from a distance. And I just think, part of me thinks, I think I'll just go downstairs and find out what that is. And the floor of the dining room was on fire.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay,
Wow.
so the point is
Love
that
the metaphor.
there are times when that thought, that feeling that
Yes.
bubbles up is something that you should pay attention
I'm
to.
so glad you raised that.
And sometimes when it's just a figment, when it's just because the toast is burning.
Yes.
So if we can just say it's all just an illusion, right?
Yes.
But if we do that, we're
We
making
risk.
a fundamental mistake, and my house would have burned down.
Yes. So
That's my question.
well, it's a great question. Well, and I'm glad you asked it because I realized I left a piece out.
Okay, great.
Based on that question. So, no, but it's a great metaphor. See, and one of the interesting things about the mind is we use physical metaphors to understand it, but they don't hold. And I'm going to show why, but I am going to answer your question. So, first of all, the part I left out. Remember how I said the principles are trying to point to the intelligence that's impersonal, that's in the mind, that accounts for all that reprogramming and learning and perspective that takes place in a more neutral state, is what I would call it. You with me? Okay. Well, one of the things that that we're pointing people to is that you can tell from your emotion the level of mental distortion. Right? You can tell. Right? So I'm suggesting, okay? Because you have this power of mind, and when people's minds are clear, it comes through in a feeling of ease, well-being, with an absence of tension and distress. It comes through in that feeling. And that's generally the kind of feeling that people have in peak performance states, moments of insight, etc., when they're most closest to their mate. So I'm suggesting in this talk that as people's thinking gets clearer, more neutral, more calmed down, they experience a less obstructed intelligence. I don't have big enough arms to illustrate it properly, but you get my point. And as they start to feel tension, the reason they feel tension is because they also have more personal, insecure, negative thoughts on the bandwidth. Right? I'm using another metaphor here. And that reduces the clarity of just pure intelligence that they have in that moment, right? Which is why people, like I work with the army, the senior army, and they say, what the hell is this about? And this is a complete waste of time. We're professionals. We don't need to talk about feelings. And what they notice when they take it seriously is that is interesting. When I feel at ease, there's an absence of tension and distress, I make all my best decisions cluster around that state, regardless of the information available, the complexity of the situation, the known and the unknown, the people involved. And as soon as there's a feeling of tension or pressure, distress, insecurity, the quality of my decisions start to go down. And we're trying to illustrate, well, that's true for everybody. Everybody's in levels of clarity, right? So as people start to feel uneasy, I'm suggesting it indicates that there's a distortion in their thinking. Right? So, using your metaphor, there's two things to say. One is, within the mind, there is no fire. Your mind's not going to burn down if you don't listen to a thought. So, and I know you didn't mean that, but sometimes people say, what if there's something serious? Well, in the mind, there's clarity and distortion. That it's all a virtual world. It's not going to, as long as you don't react to it in an unhealthy way, it's not going to do anything to you, right? So it's all false alarms when it comes to mental suffering, right? I'm suggesting. And secondly, you can see when people's thinking is more informed versus insecure by the feeling state that they're in, right? So you have someone that's very worried about something. As they calm down, all the distorted thinking disappears and they see the wood for the trees. It's more obvious what to do. And actually, you notice that when people have real intuitive inclinations, right? It comes in a very neutral feeling. It doesn't come like, you know. So I was on the beach in Hawaii. My sister-in-law dropped us off there. And I was in the beach. I was up to here in the water. And I had this little thought, you should get out. I'm like, what do you know? You're so insecure. You should have. Well, 2 minutes later, I was out further than I could get back. And if someone hadn't got me, I'd have been gone. And when I brought in, I could honestly say I knew, but I didn't respect it. So then you start to consider if your feelings are a guide to the quality of your mind in the moment, therefore your level of clarity, intelligence, perspective, insight, etc., you can use them as a guide to how seriously you take yourself moment to moment. And that's something you have to see for yourself. You're going to have to see if there's a pattern there. It's obvious to me. Now, that doesn't mean I'm right, but it's something you have to take a look at, just like those army leaders. They had to see, was that true? Is that true? So it's not to say your house isn't burning down, but it is to say if you're insecure about it, you've got two problems. It might be burning down and you're in no fit state to know, you know.
Or deal with it.
Or deal with it, exactly, absolutely.
The point for me
Absolutely.
to be put more simply is that it's the detachment. Sorry. The detachment. If you were completely overwhelmed by the sense of alarm, then you become dysfunctional. Then if my house was burning down, I would do stupid things.
Totally.
But if I can notice the alarm and just go and know the difference between a useful alarm and a non-useful alarm, then it's just something I can pay attention to and it becomes another content. But it's when it goes over my head.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know, which from a kind of brain point of view means that my neocortex and everything has been knocked out because of the fight or flight. Then I just become a headless chicken.
But it's interesting. What's interesting, that's very true, and that's a much better way of saying it. But it's interesting that as people start to see these principles, get a feel for it, they discover you have freedom as to how you relate to overwhelm. Right? So you can get in an overwhelm experience and react to it. You can get in an overwhelm experience and kind of have more ease and comfort with it. And that's something that was very enlightening to me. I didn't know you could relate to the same experience in different ways. You have a different feeling about it. But thank you for the question. I really wanted to... thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question.
One more question. So make it a good one.
Wow. Okay, so this, I wanted to ask a question about how the three principles can relate to what we do. So I've been around the principles for a few years. I've been to the conferences and I've heard a lot of people say, you know, when you really get the principles, you don't need anything else. You don't need any other kinds of therapy, you know, that's the thing. But I know that there are sort of colleagues of yours who use therapeutic drugs with psychiatric patients to kind of get them into a state where they can have clarity to accept the principles a little bit more. And I wondered if you could just talk about
here's how it works. Okay. So the truth is, because it's not an approach, there are no rules. So that's the truth. Right? Now, here's my personal perspective, and I've talked to Bill about this. You can use the principles as a tool, or it can be a foundational orienting knowledge in what you do. Right? Now, if it's a tool, it becomes one new way of helping people. So if that were true of Bill Pettit, he would say, well, you can give them drugs or you can teach them the principles, and you've got to figure out in any case which it is. Right? But he's not that way. If you talk to Bill, he says, no, that's true. Mental health is a lack of understanding, which means he's grounded in it, which means what he's up to is trying to help someone understand the principles so that they have a more understanding and healthy relationship to their experience. Now, you can do that however you want. You can do that however you can show people movies, you can use trance states, you can take them for walks, you can just talk to them, you can ignore them, you could do an interpretive dance. I mean, you can literally, but it's what you're trying to do. Like if you, to me, from this perspective, the only problem human beings have mental health-wise is that they don't understand what they're dealing with. They don't know they're mentally well already. They don't know there's nothing they need to do. And they don't know that they're just at the effect of a negative illusion that has predictable, normal effects that they don't need to worry about if they understand it. And if it looks that simple, then you're wholly based in it. But if it doesn't, then sometimes it becomes like a useful other thing to use. Just for the record, it does become a problem because as soon as it starts to look like there's a way to go about it, it's already departed from the principles, which is just an understanding. And I think that's a very difficult thing to navigate in this approach.
I was just going to say one of the things that's really occurred to me, and I feel like I do use the principles as a grounding for my work that I do as a cognitive hypnotherapist. And a lot of what I see in my clients is that it can take people with purely just trying to understand the principles, a lot to try and let go of the lack of trust that they might have, so that they can let go of the thought patterns that they're so used to. So some of the tools that we have can help them release that sooner, to be able to feel that everything's okay and they can let go and release.
Absolutely. Now, just as a counterpoint to that, I see what you're saying. Now, in my mind, and this is purely Aaron Turner, there's nobody else, I'm interested in people seeing that all they need is understanding. So I'm very reluctant to do anything other than just talk to them about it, because it's so easy for them to say, oh, there was something about that sofa or that piece of music or that technique, and then they're helped, but they kind of miss the point. Like years and years and years and years and years ago, George Pransky was doing seminars, and he'd say, oh, let's take a break, I want to take a nap. Well, what the group took away from is not your experience is an illusion, you're okay really, but you should take more naps. And the tendency of people to try to get something they can do, I'm really cautious of it as a distraction from what I'm trying to point them to. I think it's really hard for them to see that, well, all you need is some understanding, but that's just me. Shall I wrap it up? So there's just a couple things I wanted to say. I like everybody else, I have some CDs if you want things to listen to, or you have a wobbly table out there. And information about our To the Public programs. But I also wanted to know there's just a phenomenal Free Principles event every year. We put it on with Tikkun. And it's a conference. We bring some of the best speakers in the world. It's a very reasonable price. It's one of my highlight learning events of the year. It's in London, May 17, 18, 19. And if you're at all interested, it's the perfect introductory session because there's all sorts of approach, all sorts of practitioners, and it's very thorough. So you can look on 3pconference.org if you're interested in that. We'll take a break until 4.
And we've got half an hour for tea and coffee. Can everyone please put their hands together for Dr. Aaron Turner? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.